Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who will share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Welcome back to American Medieval, a podcast about the Middle Ages, but with an American twist. I'm Professor Matthew Gabriel, and I am absolutely delighted to be joined with not one, but 2 guests here today. Nancy Thebaut, an associate professor of art history at the University of Oxford and a tutorial fellow at St. Catherine's College. And also Melanie Holcomb, who is a curator in the Department of Medieval Art and the Cloisters at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. The reason that we brought them together is that they are both co-curators of the Great Spectrums of Desire exhibition now at the Cloisters and at the Met. And I am very happy to have you here. Welcome, Melanie and Nancy.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I want to talk so much about the exhibition and kind of what it represents and the kind of objects are there. But as we like to do here on American Medieval, I have, if you'll indulge me, kind of a silly question. And this question is kind of for both of you. So indulge me. And it involves time machines. Because I think anybody who studies, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that anybody who studies the past in any kind of way, shape, or form, we all have to kind of confront the question of time machines at something, or at least think about them in some way. But my question is maybe a little bit out of left field. And it is, let's imagine for a moment that we have a time machine, and that time machine has been given, respectively, to each of you, Nancy and Melanie, with the caveat that you can only use it once and you have to go back and tell a younger version of yourself, a childhood version of yourself, that you will someday grow up to study the Middle Ages. How does childhood versions of you guys react to that news?
No, this is embarrassing to say. I am not Catholic, but I went to Catholic schools. And I feel like I was already telling myself when I was, I don't know, 8 years old, you're going to be doing something with the Middle Ages. I was always just so fascinated by saints and martyrs, and we won't go into the psychology of that.
No, yeah.
And the Black Death. There were just things that were already kind of percolating even way back then. So I don't think it would have taken much convincing to tell my 8-year-old self that.
Okay. All right. So you're thinking kind of 8 to 10 years old, you're the stories of the saints, all those kind of gruesome murders. And we are on a podcast, I should say, true crime, of course, being the most popular type of podcast. So
there it is. It was early interest in true crime.
Exactly. Yeah. So just in the past. So, all right. Nancy?
Yeah. I would probably be really surprised to learn that I had become a medievalist. I was never a medieval Ren Fair girl and didn't grow up religious. And so I think, too, the idea that I've spent so much of my life now studying the history of Christianity would probably also come as quite a big surprise. But I think if I were able to explain to my younger self that I'm focusing on the really wonderful and wacky parts of medieval art history and giving it a wonderful queer and feminist spin, that hopefully my 8-year-old self would get more excited about that.
All right, so more kind of a thematic kind of connection to the rather than kind of a chronological Maybe. Okay, fair enough. And I should say too, I ask this question every time on the podcast, and it's 50-50. It's almost exactly like this. It's 50% of my guests say oh yeah, no, 100%. I knew I was going to do something with this. And 50% is no, I wanted to be as I did when I was a child. I wanted to be the first baseman for the New York Yankees. And that's what I thought. So if you told me I was going to be a teacher or something like that, I would have cried. I probably just would have cried a lot. And then maybe I would have understood, kind of in that way. But there's always kind of some sort of connection there. And Melanie, so yours kind of comes from, if I'm understanding you correctly, the kind of schooling, but also kind of the kind of evocative stories about the period that you kind of learned.
Absolutely. And I went to school in the sort of post-Vatican II era, obviously, and I had these super cool nuns. I know there's classic stories of bad nuns, but I actually had super cool nuns as teachers. And so I kind of feel like I was steeped in sort of the fascinating side of the Catholic Church very early on, and
Yeah.
they loved the stories. So, yeah.
Hmm. And so for Nancy, it was just a totally different experience. So what did kind of bring you then into the Middle Ages? So for me, like what shattered my dreams was, right, I couldn't hit a curveball, so that ruined my baseball dreams. But it was in college as an undergraduate, like I just needed a Gen Ed requirement. I took a medieval history course and I loved the professor. And I just wanted to take more classes. And that's really what got me interested in the topic, is his excitement for the period. But what is like, do you have any sort of story like that? Or like what kind of drew you into the medieval past?
Yeah, I mean, I think like for you, it was a class I took in college with Donna
Mm.
Sadler, a medieval architectural historian at Agnes Scott College, Decatur, Georgia, just outside of Atlanta. And I mean, I adored her. I adored what she was teaching. And it was also, I'd say, another second really formative experience for me was an internship at the Cloisters
Oh.
as a college undergrad right after my sophomore year of college. And I just, fell in love with the collection, got to give my first gallery talk. And so it's also just really exciting now to be able to return to the Cloisters,
Yes.
co-creating this show with Melanie after having been there as undergrad. And it's really where like I fell in love with the Middle Ages.
The Cloisters is an experience that is almost impossible to describe, especially for, I think, Americans who are even museum going Americans. It's like it's such a different, interesting space. And maybe we should just kind of start there, is talk about kind of what is the Cloisters? I'm sure some of our readers are aware of kind of the Cloisters and its relationship to kind of the Met, but maybe many aren't. So maybe I could start with that question. Like, what is the Cloisters?
Well,
Big question. It's just a tiny question, just a tiny little
it's a
question.
tiny
Yeah.
question, and I feel like I should have an answer right off the tip of my tongue, but but I've been living in it so long,
Of
I can
course.
hardly describe it. It is a branch museum of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, devoted entirely to the art of the Middle Ages. So it is not, for those who know something of New York, it is nowhere near that grand building on Fifth Avenue that's on every tourist must-see list. It's rather a hidden gem, I would say, better known to locals than to tourists often.
Mhm.
And it's uptown, put on the upper tip of the island of Manhattan, in the middle of Fort Tryon Park. So it's a little bit of a pilgrimage to get there. It is not an entire building brought over from Europe. It's made up of 4 distinct cloisters. That is that sort of courtyard space that would have been part of a medieval monastery. And there are these 4 courtyards that kind of really ground it architecturally. But it's in fact a modern-ish building. That is to say, it was built in the 1930s and kind of assembled together. And over time, by virtue of a very generous endowment from John D. Rockefeller, we've been able to kind of continue to build this collection. So it's really that collection, along with our collection of medieval art that's in the main building, really makes us one of the, I'm just going to go ahead and be boastful, one of the
Please do.
great collections of medieval art in the world. So
Yes, I will say that the first time that I went there, I was a grad student and I had heard kind of vague stories. And this is from somebody, I grew up in upstate New York, like, in the Hudson Valley, like going into the city every once in a while, like for museums and stuff like that. And with an interest in the Middle Ages and like, not knowing a whole lot about kind of the cloisters, and then going there and just being absolutely stunned, both by its magnificent setting, but then also by the collection, which is just kind of like blows your socks off if you have any interest in the Middle Ages kind of at all.
I mean, I can give the facts. Nancy, I mean, what would you say if you had to kind of describe the ambiance of the cloisters for somebody who doesn't know it?
I mean, it's a really moving space, but it's an architectural hodgepodge where you have, medieval and modern side by side. And I think it's like a really terrific space for understanding or giving you a better sense of the kind of, architectural and historical context in which these objects that are on display would have, were once viewed. And that's definitely working for us in the gallery of the objects of spectrum of desire displayed in, which is Fuente Dueña Chapel. So this 12th century Spanish apse at the very end of the gallery. Several like large works of art that are in the permanent collection that are always on view in that space are still there, in addition to the temporary exhibition in that space, but it just, it kind of just frames the viewer's experience. I think only can like heighten the emotional power too of people's encounters with those objects. And that's very ostensibly religious seeming space.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's really striking, especially for people who are used to, or I should say kind of Americans, well, not just Americans. I mean, maybe I'm being a little bit kind of provincial here in my thinking, is Americans who are used to a certain type of museum experience, but then to walk into a space in which the art is kind of, sort of, at least in some cases, kind of situated as it would have been in everyday life, like in the medieval period, like getting to see like the painted apse at the back of the church, or to walk around a cloister and to see kind of carvings and stuff like that. That's not available to many Americans in their kind of everyday museum experiences.
Yeah, it's very much medieval immersion. I think you can. In the spring and summer and fall, I guess, too, we have a beautiful garden spaces, so to kind of add to that whole experience. But even in winter, we have, a team of 3 full-time horticulturalists at the Cloisters. So even in winter, where most of our garden beds are gone to sleep, there's still sort of plants, fragrant flowers everywhere, plants everywhere. It's really, I don't know, it's sweet smelling. It's kind of divine year
It's
round.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were just there today, and Melanie and I were commenting on just how restful and restorative it can feel. Like even in the winter when you can't stand within the garden itself, being in like the, under the arcade in the space, the cloister, it's a wonderful escape like from the bustle of the city.
Yeah, a little oasis. And definitely, as you mentioned kind of, Melanie, like a little bit earlier, like definitely a pilgrimage, certainly for medievalists who are in New York City, is like they need to go up to the cloisters, and I'm sure almost all of them who visit New York at some point do. But the reason that you're both here is because of a exhibition that has recently opened called Spectrum of Desire: Love, Sex, and Gender in the Middle Ages. Could you maybe just tell us a little bit about kind of what that exhibition is to start us off?
So Spectrum of Desire is about the diverse and often really surprising ways that medieval people were thinking about love, sex, and gender. And Melanie and I have chosen to focus specifically on the period from about the 13th century to the 15th century. And that's in part because of the objects that we have at the Metropolitan Museum and at the Cloisters. We really wanted to foreground in the show that are from this particular period. It's particularly strong in this area. But it's also because, historians have long established that this is a period of time when ideas about how to love or whom to love, how to love them, how to be in relationships with one another, these ideas are hardening. It's often thought of as a more restrictive time in Western Europe, at least. And so we were interested in thinking about the ways that works of art can complicate this narrative. And, sure enough, and as, many art historians before us have established, and as we're trying to, further argue through a range of objects in the exhibition, often, works of art can reveal that people think about gender in highly fluid ways. There are expansive modes of kinship that are being explored. People are really interested in this theme of desire, the various ways that it can visually manifest. So I think the exhibition, in a way, is trying to enrich our understanding of this period through works of art. And not only what works of art can tell us about how medieval people understand these themes of love, sex, and gender, but how works of art, too, also played a really foundational role in shaping these notions, too, and shaping relationships between people, shaping the way people understand themselves, their bodies, their identity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Melanie, do you want to build on that?
No, you were perfect there. I loved exactly. I loved what you said. And I think what's been particularly gratifying about this show, and I think something we've always been wanting to do all along, is that these are themes, these love, sex, and gender, I think they are very contemporary themes. But I think one thing we very much like about the show, and I think visitors are responding to, is that they can see that these are themes that people cared about in the Middle Ages too. So there's a real kind of through line between past and present. In other ways, there's, I think, equally enjoyable and equally astonishing to people is that, whoa, they thought about those things so completely differently. than we did. So it's a wonderful show to kind of do compare contrast with our own take on these topics today.
And that's what's really kind of striking about this is that whenever I've taught, and as we were talking about before we started recording, I've been teaching here at Virginia Tech for about 20 years now, which just turns me into dust every time I kind of say that out loud. But especially when I'm teaching like an introductory course about the Middle Ages, I always try to include something by Marie de France or, primarily textual sources, but sometimes artistic sources as well. And the idea that people in the past and in the Middle Ages, like, loved each other, had sex with one another, thought about kind of gender roles and identities and stuff like that. It blows their mind. And then it opens up like all these different kind of questions for them and makes them think really in interesting ways about the past. So I can imagine that this is part of kind of that project, right? Not just to kind of showcase these types of things, but to also to show like these were people in the past and they did people things.
They did do people things. And it's quite fun when you're standing on the edges of the exhibition. I have the benefit of working there, so I can kind of tiptoe in, and to hear people having really fascinating conversations about all kinds of things in the course of this exhibition.
Oh, museum eavesdropping.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
And then giggling at times, you get a nice range of reactions as they're sort of confronted with these objects.
That's kind of one of the things, and I'm curious too, like you were saying, Melanie, kind of like being there in the edges, watching people interact. Is there a particular object that people react most strongly to, or maybe even just to frame it a different way, like what was most surprising about you as you guys were kind of putting this collection together, something that you found or, either on loan or just within the collection of the Met and the Cloisters kind of generally?
Well, I mean, I would say that in terms of works of art that it seems like people are responding to quite strongly. I mean, even from afar, being in Oxford and not in New York, as often as Melanie is, it seems that people are posting online about, or even journalists are reproducing frequently. Of course, the image of Phyllis and Aristotle, which is the signature image for our show, but people love that. They love this plate that appears next to it that Melanie calls the spanky plate. And the New York Times is obsessed with calling it the spanky plate throughout their article as well about our show. Sorry, Melanie.
I regretted using that word. Letting them in on mine.
Yeah, but I think these moments of like levity, humor feel really accessible for people. I would say most objects in the show, though, like are not very, at least don't seem very humorous, I think, to us today. But there are these moments that might feel initially a little bit like that people have an easier time connecting to.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
But I would say that actually the tone of our exhibition is in many ways like deeply serious and reverential for the most part.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, so in a way, the Phyllis and Aristotle image, I think, effectively gets people in the door for us. But actually, like, most of the moments that people will have, beyond these like, little ha-ha, like, oh, they're laughing at things that we might be laughing at today. I'm particularly struck by all of the images at the end of our exhibition that invite people to think about mystical union with Christ and how images both reflect the fantasies and desires of medieval people, like especially medieval nuns, but not only medieval nuns, to be in a kind of mystical marriage with Christ, but how objects actively shaped those fantasies or visions that people would have when to become in union with Christ. On the topic of thinking about what one of the objects is in the show that surprised me most, I would say the work that I've become like quite obsessed with and that I'm still puzzled by is this tapestry we have at the very beginning of the exhibition, immediately next to the introductory wall text. It's a late 15th century tapestry made, we think, in Strasbourg, probably once hung in someone's home. And it depicts the encounter between the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. And she has traveled from afar to ask him a series of riddles, test his wisdom, as we learn in the Book of Kings. And late medieval artists, including this one, like to imagine like what the contents of their exchange were. Like, what were these really challenging riddles that she asked? And what did he say? And one of the riddles in this case is about how gender works. And it's, how do you tell the difference between an identically dressed male and female child? So Sheba or someone has dressed them to look the same, and Solomon has to figure out basically how gender works, which one is male and which one is female. And his response is so bizarre. It's essentially that the female child will kneel when gathering apples, the male child will stand. But it's sort of this idea that like gender is expressed, not through clothing in this instance, but actually through bodily action. And, I think back to this, something that Melanie was saying a minute ago about how the show is inviting people to think about how medieval people were also interested in gender, for instance, like we are today. They certainly weren't conceptualizing, I think, necessarily the same ways that we are, but the idea that this piece was hanging in someone's home, gender is posed as a riddle, and it was a conversation starter, I imagine. Like it would have invited people to actively think about, well, how does this complex topic work exactly? And let's figure it out both in text and image when looking at this piece together. So yeah, that's been one of my favorite objects to grapple with. What about you, Melanie?
Well, I'm going to add to, and then I'm going to take us in a different direction because Nancy's far more high-minded than I am. One thing I truly love, Nancy's the person who really introduced me to that tapestry, and I start every tour, almost every lecture with it because it's such a brilliant way to demonstrate to people, again, they're thinking about the same things we're thinking about, but they're answering these questions in very different ways. And I just wanted to add that the person who's responding and thinking about this is no less than King Solomon himself. Yes. And the Queen of Sheba, these are the medieval way of thinking. These are the great minds being asked to ponder these questions. It's serious stuff that need a great mind to think about. So I always like to kind of add that. I note when people go into the exhibition that they can't help but be drawn to this very large sculpture of not quite life-size, three-quarter size, life-size image of Saint Sebastian. And it's a sculpture that we actually had conserved for the show. It had been kind of languishing in the corner of the medieval sculpture hall in the main building. And I asked our conservator if there was anything she could do with it. He looked kind of diseased, and she wasn't sure. But lo and behold, Lucretia Cargere, our great sculpture conservator, got to work on it and began to take away some of these late interventions that had been discolored, that made it look quite mottled and diseased, as I said. And now what you see now is a sculpture that is just gleaming and beautiful. Much of its original polychromy is on view. And what can't be denied is that it is an erotic sculpture. It is in every way set up to kind of give you the hots for this guy. I mean, it's
sexy really, Sebastian.
Right. It's Sebastian, right? And I think people are accustomed to that in a slightly later period, but this is a medieval courtly body, so it's a slightly different body type than I think most folks are familiar with in looking at art. And it's just extraordinary the way that his chest is thrust out and his loincloth is mighty low, so low that there's actually little bits of pubic hair that peek out. This is original paint. I just want to say that's not, that peek out from the top of the loincloth. He otherwise is hairless because the ideal, of course, is a youthful body. But he's got this pinched waist and, kind of serious pecs and long legs and then gazing upward. He's just, you can't help but be drawn to him, which is, of course, the point.
Yeah.
And for me, I think the show is interesting to me on the level of sort of what is erotic? What does something erotic? Would the same thing be erotic today as was erotic then? How did they understand eroticism? Part of why I love the Spanky Plate and the Phyllis and Aristotle story myself is that, it really lays bare the way in which power is as an important feature of medieval eroticism. I think for that alone, it's the exploration of what makes people desirous is a big thread that runs throughout the show. And there's kind of a lot of objects that get me thinking about that topic, Sebastian being one of them.
Yeah, and as you were saying too, I mean, like the many ways that we can think about desire too, right? Like there's spiritual desire and then sexual desire, and those are not necessarily in the Middle Ages, nor today, I should say, in many communities, kind of totally separate things. And the other thing too, I loved about both of your examples is that, for a long time, as you guys both know, is that oftentimes the Middle Ages are portrayed as kind of one thing or the other. They're either this far away, distant land in which it's just a totally kind of unknown continent and everything is just weird and different over there. Or it's just like us, but they were, in black and white instead of in color, like, kind of old timey. I always joke with my students sometimes is that they think of it like those old videos of like Babe Ruth, right? Where everything's like sped up and they're, everything's in black and white and stuff like that. But in your cases, in both of these objects, like it's kind of both. Like it's similar. We can kind of understand it because it has these lines of connection, but it is actually a different time and a different place. And so they had different understandings of kind of what does a desirous body look like back then? How does an object evoke that desire? Questions about gender, like people are thinking about gender kind of in very similar ways to where people are thinking about gender today, which is kind of dominating a lot of political discourse nowadays, right? But they're thinking about it in very different ways. They're understanding, they're asking different questions, and it requires kind of, as Melanie and Nancy were both saying, like it requires the wisdom of Solomon himself in order to try to disentangle this. And then, he says, well, one stands and one kneels, and just like, okay, man, like, sure. Okay. Sounds great. Yeah. I mean, is that a satisfying answer? I don't know. I guess for them,
it worked for them.
But it worked for them.
It made a great tapestry. Let me tell you right now.
Great tapestry. That's right. So, as you said, a think piece. So, yeah.
Yeah. But even like, with that tapestry, it's like Solomon's response seems so self-assured. But then when you actually start to look at the tapestry more carefully, like there's another riddle in there about whether or not a flower is real or fake based on whether or not a bee will land on it. The way the artist has chosen to depict this particular narrative in the same tapestry, the bee hasn't yet landed on the flower, so we'll never know which one is real or which one's merely a work of art. And then, and I looked at a few tapestries of the same subject made in the following century, and there it's sometimes the male child that kneels. So I think like this notion, that's a natural law that, little girls will kneel when gathering apples, whereas little boys won't. I think that people didn't even understand that as like a hard and fast rule. I mean, it's what Solomon says in the case of this one tapestry. But
yeah.
I think that, yes, it's Solomon and he's so wise and, he is, grappling with the topic of gender here. But I think that a lot of it was still like up in the air for a lot of people. And even for other artists treating the same subject.
It's not only that, but it's a contested space, right? Or a contested kind of topic, right? Like you were saying, it's just, and as we can't lose sight of, like, this is one artist's rendition of the answer to that question, right? Like whether that is kind of universally applicable, well, that's another question entirely, right?
Yeah. I mean, we think a lot about gender in this exhibition, especially in this one section that we've entitled Beautiful Bodies. And you might remember there's a whole case of manuscripts, several of which are from the Morgan Library, one that's from the Princeton University Library, and then one or two from our own collection. And I mean, even within the same manuscript, we have this incredible manuscript with text from the Golden Legend translated into French. And for each story, there's an image of that particular saint's life. And within the same manuscript, the artist is choosing to depict the gender of saints in different ways. And by that, I mean, perhaps as people have talked about on this podcast before, your listeners will be familiar with the fact that, over 30 saints, we know, change their gender presentation over the course of their lifetime, often from female to male. So there's this idea they're kind of ascending the gender hierarchy and becoming more masculine. And, for two such saints whose stories are recorded in text and image in this manuscript, the artist, took very different approaches to how to depict their gender. So in the case of one saint, so Saint Marine, sometimes called Marinos, the artist chose to depict this saint as only male. They're depicted twice in the same image.
Okay.
And there isn't kind of this like outing of the saint as, female body. But that's an approach many artists took in other examples. And then we just did page turns in the manuscript today. And the image that we're now showing in that manuscript is of a different saint, Saint Theodore or Theodora. And there we see, within a single painting, the female presenting version of the Saint Theodora on the left side of the image. And then Theodore, the monk, so after the saint is married, they are tricked by a witch into committing adultery, and they repent by becoming a monk. We see that the artist has chosen to depict just to the right of the image of them as like, a female presenting person as a male monk. So wanting to show that kind of gender transition that takes place.
Yeah.
So it just, the rules for gender are not hard, like whatsoever. It's happening in so many different ways, these manuscripts. And Melanie and I, we really wanted to show lots of different examples of artists who are thinking about gender. And in fascinating ways and show there's not only like one way to be thinking about the fluidity of gender in the medieval past.
And it's making me think too, Nancy, about another object in the show that we've talked a lot about, which is the little ivory with the fountain of youth, which has naked bodies on it, sort of young naked people cavorting in a fountain. And what's so interesting there is that you have to be very well versed in hairstyles and very to know who is the male and who is the female. So though they are naked, you actually cannot tell girls apart from boys. And what's important here, and I think what's often important in discussions of sort of medieval love, is not whether you're a boy or a girl or a man or a woman, but whether you're young or old. That's far more important, because love is really a young person's game. And so there's a whole sort of another thread through this exhibition about sort of the ways in which bodies sometimes can't be read at all, sometimes, or the ways in which certain bodies, like the body of Christ, has both male and female characteristics.
Yeah. It's got me thinking too about what Nancy and Melanie, what you were both talking about, those objects is about audience, is about medieval audience specifically. Is that so dissociated from the museum setting? Is that back in the day, like, a manuscript would be read by a certain type of person, an ivory by another. So maybe you could, just for our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with kind of how these objects were kind of used, if you just talk a little bit about like who would be asked to make these distinctions about hairstyle, and in order to understand kind of what these things were trying to convey. And that's, again, a huge question, but maybe just like focusing on like one object or something like that could be useful for people to think about this. Thanks for listening, y'all. As you know by now, this is the time when I tell you about another great podcast from Multitude. Wow, If True is your one-stop internet culture shop, explaining how what's happening online shapes the world. And the hosts, the internet experts and real-life besties, are the ones to unravel it. Tech culture journalist Amanda Silberling and science fiction author/attorney Isabel J. Kim, Esquire. Amanda and Isabel ask the burning questions on everyone's minds. Like in one of their most recent episodes, why does ChatGPT suck so much? Because it does. Find out with new episodes every other Wednesday. Add it to your playlist now. Thanks, and now back to American Medieval.
Melanie, do you want to talk about your writing tablets, maybe?
Yeah, I think, I will say a couple of things. I'm going to let Nancy, I'll have you talk more about manuscripts. I feel like I'm a lover of these ivories, and I like to think a lot about notions of courtly love. And we talk a lot about the fantasy of courtly love, and the way in which courtly love is very much part of that fantasy is that it takes place among the aristocracy. I can't say that people who weren't aristocratic weren't also caught up in I presume, in fact, they were caught up within the same kind of fantasies that courtly love presents. But the point of courtly love is that it's taking place within an aristocratic realm. I would say almost all of the objects in our show are intended for an elite audience. There, I'm sure, are exceptions that Nancy could probably bring up just like that. But I would say, by and large, that is not the case for this show. They are almost all, I think, intended for elite audiences, not only in the kinds of stories and figures that they depict, but also in who would have owned and seen and used them. There are different settings for these objects, but I don't think, let's not kid ourselves. I hate to keep coming back. I feel like it's a leitmotif, Phyllis and Aristotle and the spanky plate. But the one reason you
get to see spanky plate so much.
Yeah,
it's so
I can
great.
say over and over again. But the two objects, in part, they're sitting next to one another in a case because they actually are one of the few examples where you can really see sort of the ways in which these ideas about the erotic and about power play out in sort of amongst two different kind of social classes. Phyllis and Aristotle are both. Aristotle is, of course, royal. Phyllis is thought to be a princess, and they're doing their thing, wearing aristocratic clothing, the fashionable belts of their day. the brass plate showing a woman spanking her husband, aka the spanky plate, is actually shows medieval householders. Really, these are with a similar kind of idea where she's kind of riding atop. In this case, we presume a wife riding atop her husband, kind of spanking his bare bottom, something aristocrats. You don't really get to see the bottoms of aristocrats too often. And spinning equipment is kind of flying everywhere. So it's, in some ways, that plate, which I don't imagine was particularly an elite object, but certainly somebody with enough money to buy a decorated plate, say. But it is kind of one point in the show where we really kind of try to bring out a little bit of sort of class distinctions. I would say that is by and large sort of not something we do too very much in the show. I guess the other place, Nancy,
the print,
right, where we have a royal manuscript for the Bun of Luxembourg that looks she would have used to focus her attention on the wound of Christ. And then adjacent to that is a very humble print that would have been, I don't want to say dime store, but nothing like what we're talking about with the manuscript, but it would have been available at a much cheaper price for some other devotee to focus their attention on the wound of Christ. So I think we have a couple of places where we can sort of set up those distinctions between viewers and users of art.
Yeah, just like you were saying, kind of the differences of class, I think they can be kind of submerged if you're not kind of familiar with the cost of production of a lot of these things. Like, I mean, ivory was, not like extraordinarily rare, but like it cost you some money in order if you wanted it, nicely carved or something like that. Whereas, the production of a plate, or as you were saying, after the introduction of the printing press, like much more available to a wealthy kind of middle class or something like that, or a wealthier, I should say, kind of middle class. But Nancy, you were going to say something about manuscripts. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's some objects in the show where, unfortunately, we really just don't know, who was looking at these pieces. In several instances, though, we do have a pretty good idea of, if not the precise person, like Bun of Luxembourg, whom Melanie just mentioned, we would know the type of person that would have, been looking at this. So I'm thinking of specifically in this mystical union section that we have at the end of the exhibition. There are several objects that we know, like this particular painting would have been in a Carthusian monk's cell, or this particular sculpture of the infant Christ was most likely owned by a nun. Same thing with the tremendous statue of Christ and St. John, which is really kind of, the pinnacle object of the show. I mean, you see it as soon as you walk into the gallery. It's the very end of the gallery within the Fuente apse, such a moving piece, as well as the visitation group. And we also know precisely, where that's from, the St. Catharinenthal convent, and that it was also seen by nuns. So in the case of the manuscripts of say, the Golden Legend book that I was talking about before, we know the patron of that particular book, Jean d'Auxy. It doesn't look like a book that was used a whole lot, though. The pages and paintings are just pristine. So it can be really difficult for us to make arguments about the kind of reception this book would have had. The other images in that particular case, or other manuscripts in that particular case, include 2 books of hours, so private devotional books. In one case, a royal manuscript. The other one, I don't think we know who the patron was, but still works that, it's interesting. And I remember I've discussed this with students in the past when teaching images like this, that, so many images of saints who change their gender presentation over the course of their lifetime are found in these more private settings.
Oh, huh.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's because it somehow felt more like a safer space to include these types of images, but it's true. I mean, we have, for instance, I can think of a capital at Vézelay that depicts Saint Eugenius or Eugenia, or there's a big panel painting at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris that also depicts this particular saint. But actually, most of these images of these, 30 plus saints are in manuscripts and intended not for, multiple people to be looking at them at once, but really for one focused encounter, probably with an individual.
That's really interesting, too, because, the idea that this would be acceptable to a patron who is commissioning a manuscript like that, that probably says something, too. This would be of interest to them that they would be willing to do this. The thing that I'm thinking about, and this is kind of a half-formed thought, is because like we've been talking a little bit about nuns, and I think that a lot of people think, about the Middle Ages, they're thinking exclusively about kind of monks or men. And then in these private devotional spaces, like in books of hours or things that are used by families, like how often are women encountering these types of things? Do we have a kind of any sense of kind of the objects that you're talking about? Like even your sexy Sebastian, who we were talking about kind of earlier, like, is that an object of desire primarily for men or for women, or we don't know, or who knows?
I think we know in that particular case, do we,
We
Melanie? For
don't.
many other
We
objects in the
don't.
show, we do. But I mean, I think Melanie and I really were able to go all in with our nun research, was in this mystical union section, especially.
Yeah.
And I mean, in a way, the scholarship was so rich and almost overwhelming. I
Mm.
mean, and by that I mean not only, secondary sources, but the primary sources that survive,
course.
nuns talking about their experiences with devotional objects, including some of the one like objects that we have in our exhibition. We're studying texts about nuns looking at, I believe this was specifically at St. Caterina, if I'm not mistaken, Melanie, looking
Yes.
at a statue like the Christ and St. John sculpture at the end of our
Oh.
show. And some of these nuns, I mean, we're really reading like their firsthand accounts of what it was like for them to see these sculptures or witnessing their sisters look at these sculptures. So in the case of the Catherinental sculpture, one of the sisters sees her sister like glow like a crystal. Is that right?
Yeah. Levitate and glow.
Levitate. Yeah. And glow like a crystal.
Don't forget the
And
levitation.
Don't forget the levitation, right?
yeah.
And I think the power of that is so extraordinary too, because I think this, for people who haven't seen this object, it's a very, very tender image. Oh, I don't know, maybe 3 feet tall.
Yeah, maybe even a little taller. Yeah.
Of Jesus and his beloved apostle John leaning with his head on the breast of Jesus. And so it's a very tender exchange between two men that gets used as a way to imagine one's own kind of union with God. And so there's a kind of, in a female monastery, there's a bit of gender bending that ends up having to happen here, where you're really using this tender image of two men as a way to imagine your own kind of potential of your own mystical union with Jesus. And so it's fascinating, and it's another place, I would say, where the Middle Ages kind of exceeds our own modern imagination. These descriptions remind us of what a heady and intoxicating encounter it could be to stand before an image like this.
Yeah, and that probably goes back to something we were talking about earlier about the types of desire, right? And the kind of fuzzy, almost non-existent line at times between sensual desire and ecstatic or desire of the divine, right? In that it's difficult to depict both in text but also in objects as well. Like, what does mystical union look like, right? Like, I mean, that's a question, right? So, and the fact that people were really thinking about it and it mattered to them and they were trying to do it and they were doing it in all these different ways, I think should allow us to see this particular period, the Middle Ages, as just rich in artistic production, but also kind of an imagination as well.
And I think this part of the show, which is the very last thing you see, the show is not particularly linear in character, but we did want to culminate with this idea of mystical union because it brings together so many of the other ideas in the show, ideas about marriage, ideas about gender, ideas about the erotic, and also about spiritual desire. And I don't think it's an accident that in some ways some of the most beautiful objects of the show, they're all kind of clustered at the end. It's really kind of peak experience. We like to remind visitors that for a medieval person, there was almost no better way to describe the kind of love they sought with God than to speak about it in what we would consider sexual terms. That is kind of the highest way to think about the love of God. And so I think, again, that's a place where we moderns really can kind of look at ourselves as at a very different place than the medieval world, where those sort of the erotic and the religious merged together in profoundly affecting ways. And works of art were some of the best places to kind of see that combination sort of come together.
Yeah.
Nancy, I keep looking at you because I really, she's been waiting for she mentioned that we turned the pages today in the show, and we finally turned the page to a page in the Rothschild Canticles. I know she's been waiting for, so I'm setting you up to talk about this book and this image that I just feel like people should know about, right?
I'm excited now. Yeah, here we go. Okay.
Yeah, it's another one of the superstar objects in our exhibition. We feel so lucky to have it. It's typically at the Beinecke Library at Yale. It's this incredible small devotional manuscript made for a nun around 1300 in northern France. And it has this image cycle. The book has been written on extensively by Jeffrey Hamburger, among other people. And it has this incredible visual cycle that is largely inspired by the Song of Songs, so the super erotic poem in the Hebrew Bible. And the images are just highly creative. The artist came up with this, in many ways, super original visual program to bring like the erotics of that poem to life and to serve as an important devotional tool for the nun using these images so she could imagine her own kind of mystical union with God, like between the sponsus and the sponsa, the bride and bridegroom in the Song of Songs. And so Melanie mentioned that this is in the final section of the show, and I think we both felt strongly that there needed to be like a slow build to this section. And so the first section of the show, because I mean, as you pointed out already, Matthew, this idea that erotics and religion coincide in the Middle Ages, this can be a somewhat jarring idea for some people today. And I think we didn't want to begin with that because that could just feel like a little too much. Like, we wanted to really to build at the end. And moreover, it was important for us to begin the show with a section on earthly marriage and sex and chastity, because the visual vocabulary of earthly marriage, of conjugal relations with one spouse, all this and where it takes place in the bed, all of this is taken up visually in images of mystical union. So for instance, in this super erotically charged image that we just turned to today in the Rothschild Canticles, we see a woman in her bed alone underneath these rumpled sheets, lying down, and she's reaching up above to this figure of Christ peering down from a sun with these very phallic kind of rays, these sort of tentacles reaching out towards her body. She looks like she is having a great time. But we see there that the bed is there, the sheets are there, this kind of union that we see actually earlier in a manuscript in the marriage and sex section of the show, from the Regime du Corps, the Regiment of the Body manuscript, where we have like an image showing what conjugal relations between a husband and wife look like in a very kind of all clothes are on, no nonsense, man on top of woman.
The bed is like made with the sheets, the bedspread pulled tight, very different from those undulating sheets of the
sheets,
in the Rothschild Canticles.
It's like pleasure is really, I think, an afterthought in the Regime du Corps image at the start of the show. But when we see the Rothschild Canticles image and other images of mystical union, you could see the erotics are just like fully on view compared to this earlier section of the show. And in terms of also just the visual language of earthly marriage and mystical marriage, we see some overlap there as well. So a lot of images of earthly couples, you'll frequently see their joining of the right hands, like something that would happen during like medieval wedding ceremonies. You see this in, for instance, also the sculpture of Christ and St. John. At the end, they're holding hands as if kind of a wedded couple. So it's interesting how, artists are taking the visual language of marriage and even sexual union sometimes and transposing it, adding a lot of like erotics into the mix, and just bringing it to a whole new level in the context of mystical union.
I love the fact too, and I'm sure like it took me a while kind of to understand how exhibitions are sometimes laid out like that in order to establish a vocabulary so that you understand as you move through, oh, you're seeing those things again, but they're being used in different ways, and that can mean something, and we can understand it together. It's making that medieval world kind of accessible, right? Like, and it's making it understandable, even in its weirdness sometimes. So, or erotics, I should say.
That's the hope. I'm convinced that if you just walk straight to the back of the show, to the last images of the show, you would just be knocked out by the sheer gorgeousness of those objects. They're just such knockouts.
I mean, the best thing to do would just be to visit it several times, right?
Exactly.
To visit the exhibition
That's it.
several times. Go straight to the back, be knocked out, and then slowly build up.
Go the other direction. Go
the other direction. Like just keep going to spectrums of desire at the Cloisters is ultimately our message. So yes, and with that, unfortunately, we are starting to run out of time here. This has been an absolutely magnificent conversation. I can't wait to hear from some of our listeners who are going to rush out and go to the show as soon as they possibly can. So Spectrums of Desire, Love, Sex, and Gender in the Middle Ages is on view at the Cloisters. How long is it on view until?
The end of March. So
end of March.
We'll still have time.
Okay, yes. This episode will air, as I'm sure our listeners will know because they will be listening to it at the time, is going to air in mid-February, so they got plenty of time to get out there and get their tickets. And then to see lovely Fort Tryon Park and kind of the northern part of Manhattan, it's a really amazing setting. And then walk around the rest of the museum, too. There's probably some other stuff they should see in the Cloisters.
A few things.
If people do want to find out more about you, Melanie, your work, Nancy, your work, where can they find you kind of online? And we will, of course, drop links to the exhibition and stuff like that as well.
I'm all about the metmuseum.org. That's where
there you go.
That's where I live, in the medieval department there. There's a lot of information about the show as well in our exhibition section there. So that's probably the easiest spot to find out about me and the Cloisters, the Met, the exhibition. Nancy, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on academia and I frequently post things I publish on there. Otherwise, there's my Oxford University site, and I'll be in and out of New York a little bit over the next few months. So like Melanie, doing different talks in the Space of the Gallery. So I'd encourage people too, when they come visit the show, to sign up for a gallery tour, an expert talk. And there's a lot of programming going on over the next couple of months.
Fantastic. And that's so great. And then if, to our listeners as well, if you see, some people kind of smiling off on the corner, watching people enjoy the exhibition, maybe it's Melanie or maybe it's Nancy. So, you can go up and maybe say hi.
We giggle too in there.
Yes.
We do.
Feel free to giggle in the exhibition. I think that's the one takeaway here. So if you haven't taken anything else, it's okay to giggle in a museum. Thank you again, Melanie and Nancy. This has been an absolutely amazing conversation. Thank you, everyone, for listening to another episode of American Medieval. And until next week, we will see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.